Welcome to another episode of the Indoor Environment Show. I'm Bob Krell, founder and publisher of Healthy Indoors Media. Yeah, I remember where I'm from now. And joined us as usual by my co-host, Mr. Don Weeks, coming live from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. He is the president of the IEQGA, the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance. Hi, Don. Good to see you as always.
Hi, Bob. How are you? Everything going well?
Well, after stumbling through my own name and introduction, yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah, I'm excited about this show. These are two friends of mine, colleagues, and I think we'll get to have a good discussion today. Before we get started, though, I want to remind everyone to mention that the IQ radio show, that the guest will be Jim Rosenthal to discuss air cleaning, filtration, and the Corsi Rosenthal box. And that's going to be broadcast at the same time we're broadcasting this particular one, but you can catch both of these shows on the podcast and audio cast, webcast after the show's end.
Yep, and they're actually where you're watching us now. If you are on the Healthy Indoors online global community, IQ Radio is also there too on a separate channel. So we've got that all there, so you can watch all of these wonderful shows, both live and after.
Yes, great. So let me introduce our two guests today. First is Max Sherman. Max attended UCLA for a degree in BS in physics and chemistry. He also attended UC Berkeley and received a PhD in physics. He's currently the owner and principal consultant at EPD Consulting Group, where he provides expert services to clients regarding HVAC, indoor air quality, and building science. Max also works as a rehired retiree at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. Hello, Max.
Howdy. How is everybody today?
Good. And your other guest today is Bill Bahnfleth. Bill started his university education at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Boy, I messed that one up. With a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineer at the same university, which I will not repeat. He received a master's degree and a PhD in mechanical engineering. He also earned a degree in music at the university, which I find very fascinating. Currently, Bill is at Penn State as a professor of architectural engineering, and previously Bill was the director of Indoor Environmental Center at Penn State. Good morning or good day, Bill.
Yeah, Don, glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you both here too. So today we're going to focus in on the new standard of 241, which is entitled Control of Infectious Aerosols. So just to get us started, Bill, how did you get into the position? You were chosen to chair the committee to develop 241, and you selected Bill, Max as his vice chair. And of course, we all know, having seen many headlines on this was in a record-breaking timeline of approximately 6 months from December 2022 to June 2023. From your perspectives as leaders of this project committee, why was it necessary to fast track this standard?
Yeah, well, ultimately, the reason that it was fast tracked was because the White House COVID response team asked for it. So Ashish Jha, after a lot of preliminaries we don't have time to go through, decided that what really needed to be done was to have a national pathogen control standard, and ASHRAE was best positioned to do that. So Jha came to the ASHRAE leadership, to Farouk Mahbub, in November, and said, we'd really like you to do this, and could you do it by March? Because they wanted a standard by the time the COVID restrictions ended, and we said not quite that fast, but we'll do it by June. So that was really the driver for not doing this by the normal standards process, which we'd probably be working on it for another year or two before we issued the first version. But I have to say, I'm not sure we would have developed a standard at all. We might not have even started by this point if it wasn't for that. So the push was a good thing, although it also created some consequences that we're going to have to deal with as we go downstream.
And we'll talk about those perhaps a little later. How is, besides Max as your vice chair, how is the other members of the committee selected?
Well, of course, we had to look at the expertise that it would take to put together a standard like this, expertise in risk assessment and in public health and in air distribution and in commissioning because of the need to assess facilities and implement. So that was one aspect of it. We also needed to have a team that we really believed could get it done that quickly. And so I looked a lot to members of the epidemic task force that I also chaired, who'd been very productive when we put together this roster. And Max was one of those. He chaired the residential team on the epidemic task force, and he has a very long and deep experience with standards. And I thought that the combination of his technical background and his standards experience would make him an ideal whip, if you will, to help us get this standard put together in the required time frame. And it proved to be true.
Yeah, I mean,
How
as
many-
far,
how
as
many
far as your
members?
ability to
Go
get
ahead.
it in that amount of time, it's astonishing, to be honest. You know, just with the way that standards development typically happens in this industry, this was breakneck speed.
Indeed.
We did what we called, or well, at least what I called, the Tiger Team approach, which, if you remember, was what they did after the ill-fated Apollo 13, where we put together teams and said, okay, we have to get something done by this time. Failure is not an option. We're going to get it done. We can't do the usual standards thing of making everything perfect. So that's what we did. Basically, everybody worked really hard, sometimes 2 meetings a week in each group, in order to get what we needed to get done on time and in an acceptable way.
You know, I think just to expand on that point a little bit, yes, we weren't going to get everything perfect. I think in general, if we didn't think something was well enough formed to be in the standard, at this point, we left it out. So I think you know, that's some of the things we need to do in the future is add some things back in and enhance some things that are perhaps treated a little lightly in this version.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the case. My understanding, and you can correct me if it's, I should know this, but basically the 241 committee will be meeting on a regular basis to go over things that are going to come in either from other members or from somebody outside the group to discuss, comment, question these various sections of the standard.
Well, we're basically going back under normal ASHRAE procedures, ANSI procedures, and then Max is a whiz on those. So maybe he could fill in some of the details about what will be different going forward.
Right. So we broke all the rules. Well, not all of them, but we broke many of the rules of ANSI in order to get this out in this breakneck speed. So it is an ASHRAE standard, but it is not an ANSI standard. And one of our jobs is to make it an ANSI standard. That means we have to go back and put out the entire standard for a full public review and do all the normal public review things that we have to do. Along with that, we'll be fixing things that we find or including things that come up to make it better. So although we got the ASHRAE standard out in 4 months, it's still another couple of years probably before it will fully get its ANSI designation.
And anybody who wants to put in a continuous maintenance proposal or ask for an interpretation, that can be done right now. And we have, I guess, at least a dozen, maybe close to 20 CMPs that have already come in.
And to make sure we know, everybody knows what the acronym means. CMP stands for
Continuous maintenance proposal.
And
That's
there is
you propose a change to the standard. You can do that through the ASHRAE website and the comment database there.
Okay, and we can post that perhaps as part of this program, where that is, because I'm not sure everybody knows where that is within the ASHRAE website.
Sure.
Good. All right. So Max, let's start with you on the next question. What is in your mind the 3 most important sections of the standard?
Well, as Bill said, I'm an old standards guy. And so the most important part of any standard is its title, purpose, and scope. That's what tells everybody what to expect from the standard. That's what says what is included and what isn't included. And in the title, purpose, and scope of this standard, we see some key terms that come to define the standard. infection reduction management mode, equivalent clean air, air cleaning, a whole bunch of things that really make up the standard are talked about there, and that's where the important stuff is. Now, to the non-standard geeks, it's often the table of rates is the most important thing. If you ask any normal person what the most important thing of the 62 standard is, then they'll tell you, oh, well, that's the table of rates that I have to meet. But in some ways, that's the end product and not necessarily the most important part of the thing. From a practical standpoint, there are other parts of that are important, and I think Bill likes to talk about those.
Well, I think, once you get past the basic, what is the standard about, then there's the technical content. And in this standard, we have a number of sections that I would say deal with requirements, and then others that deal with how to decide how to implement them. So as Max has touched on, I think obviously equivalent clean air is one of the top requirements. The requirements that deal with testing of air cleaners also critically important, because that all rolls into the concept of equivalent clean air to meet the requirements of the standard. And I think an important section that isn't really to the point of being highly important yet is going to be the one on air distribution, because we know there are a lot of factors that affect the performance of systems to control infectious aerosols that have to do with air distribution, and that's more lightly developed. The stuff on implementation, of course, is also very important, but maybe more straightforward and more like what you might have seen in other existing standards for commissioning.
Well, I wondered, basically, I use that as a sort of a generalized question, three most important sections, but there's really no section I can honestly say is not important in some regards. Every one of the sections, including some of the appendices, are critical in this regard. So let's take another way of looking at this. Is there sections, Bill, of the standard which require additional work, and why?
Sure. Well, we could kind of tick through them. The risk assessment process that led to the table of equivalent clean airflow requirements was based on really one set of assumptions. So I think there's some scope there to revisit that and look at perhaps a more flexible approach, because that's really critical. The air distribution part of it, we just weren't ready to say what the requirements should be for certain things. So there's an intent to go there and look at ventilation effectiveness, essentially, and putting in better requirements as to what to do about the airflow. And we've kind of pushed the market, I would say, on air cleaner standards. We're actually a little bit out ahead of some standards in development. So I think that's going to continue to change as more good test procedures get published for the laboratory piece of it, and we need to work on scaling. So how do you go from a lab to an actual installation? So that's my view, and maybe Max has other things to add here as well.
Well, I think it's not a finished standard, of course, but perhaps no standard is actually finished. So users will inform us of what things we need to look at in more detail. As we look at some of the other sections, the appendix and other definitions, we'll see that we made certain decisions that might be limiting at the moment because we didn't know how to make them broader. We'll have to definitely make them broader. It's an ongoing process. No standard is ever actually done.
I wanted to point out, actually, Bill had put in the notes for us that there is, for the continuing maintenance, there is a website link that you can go to. We'll put that in the show notes, so you'll be able to get to this directly later. Just wanted to point that out.
Yes. One of the things you mentioned, Bill, was risk assessment. Now, that has different meanings in different professions. In my industrial hygiene profession, we basically deal with risk assessment in terms of evaluating whether something is airborne, whether it's at a certain concentration above the threshold limit value, things of that nature. But I don't think that's what exactly it means in this particular standard. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, in this context, we're talking about how do you quantify the probability of infection so that you can specify an equivalent clean airflow rate that will limit that probability to what you consider to be acceptable. So this was an analytical process where we had to, for the space types that were covered, make assumptions about things like the number of occupants and the occupant density, and what is the pathogen, because you have to assume the characteristics of the pathogen, how long does it stay active, and how is it distributed in the aerosol, so that affects deposition, all of those sorts of parameters. But we had to make a lot of choices that were pretty specific, and I think we should consider broadening those.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, like, equivalent air change can be, that's kind of a complex area, right? Because when you're dealing with particulate, as opposed to gaseous contaminants, most of the air cleaning technology that we see out there we're seeing is really dealing with particulate for the most part, the portable equipment. It's HEPA. I mean, there may be some impregnated carbon filtration, but it's not really, a true sorbent. So I think that's, for the general public, I think that's a challenging thing, because I think many of them think that these air cleaners also are, a surrogate to ventilation.
Well, to some aspect of ventilation, this is the whole thing with performance-based air quality control, and instead of just throwing outdoor air at the contaminants and hoping we're getting all of them down to reasonable levels, we're trying to identify which are the key ones and controlling those. And actually, Max has been involved in some really interesting harm-based research that he might want to mention here in that context.
Sure. Why do we ventilate? Andy personally used to say we ventilate for no particular reason, but we really ventilate for indoor air quality. But what's indoor air quality? That means controlling specific contaminants. Now, 241 is limited to infectious aerosols. It doesn't care about gaseous contaminants. You can have an equivalent clean air is just a number that tells us what dilution of the contaminant are you getting, and how is it equivalent to as if you had pure clean air, remembering that outdoor air isn't necessarily clean to start with. So in 241, the concept of equivalent clean air is a key concept. We've defined it as being the ability to dilute the pathogen of concern, whether by removing it, whether by filtering it, whether by inactivating it. It doesn't really matter. What matters is there's less of it in the air. And that's what we're talking about. That could be applied to any other contaminant as well. You could have equivalent clean air in terms of a particular VOC or in terms of particulates, which would be very close to CADR as it's commonly known. But that's what equivalent clean air is.
Yeah, so it's a simple example. We estimate, and it's in a table in the standard, that a MERV 13 filter removes 77% of the infectious aerosol going through it. And so in equivalent clean air terms, if you had 100 actual CFM of air going through that filter, we would say that was equivalent to 77 CFM of equivalent clean air. It's very much like CADR.
And from 241's point of view, it filtered air and outdoor air are the same. We don't really care how you got the pathogen out of the air.
And maybe that's a place to make the important point that this is not a new indoor air quality standard. It doesn't replace any of the standards we're used to following. So that the prerequisite for 241 is that you comply with whatever base standard for acceptable indoor air quality you're already following.
And that would be, at least initially, the 241 would be requirement is that you comply with 62.1 for commercial buildings, 62.2 for residential buildings, and I think it's at 170. I get sometimes. Yeah. Now, how does, is that the best starting point for most people, is to start with trying to comply with those particular standards before they try to tackle 241?
Well, if you can't get basic acceptable indoor air, then you're probably already starting off in the wrong place to begin with. So you can't comply with 241 without complying with a base standard. Now, if you're in some other country and you have some other base standard for IAQ, that's okay too. But the idea is you have to use a base standard for IAQ, and then there may be additional requirements in order to meet 241. And 241, remember, is a resiliency standard. It's not supposed to be run at that rate all the time. It's only when it's determined that you need to run it in IRMM.
And we're going to get to that in a second, because that is my next question, really. But basically, just to make sure we've wrapped up that whole equivalent airflow rate, or ECA, how is that calculated, and what does it provide to the building management and mechanical engineers in evaluation of the building? Max, you want to start on that one?
Well, so it's calculated through Section 5. There's a table that tells you how much ECA per person is required in a certain space. Now, you can meet that by upping the ECA, or you can meet that by lowering the number of people in the space. That's up to your plan on how you intend to comply. But that's the number that's there. It could be as simple as upgrading your filters in an existing system. It could be portable air cleaners. It could be UV. It could be more outdoor air. There's all sorts of ways to meet it. But that's what the engineer has to do, is figure out the most cost-effective way to meet that in their particular environment.
Okay. Bill, you have anything to follow up on that?
Only to say that I'd add that they're in terms of equivalent clean air per person, because that's actually what personal risk is proportional to. In the risk analysis, it was done for the standard. We're assuming that the probability of an infector being present is a function of how many people are there and what the community incidence rate is, and you can show that the airflow per person is what's important, and there's really no direct relevance to air change rates, unfortunately, because they're so widely used as the standard for infection control.
Well, that brings up a point, is that you have ACH, air changes per hour, which many people, particularly in the health and safety field, are familiar with. You've now gone to CADR in many cases, and now we're going to the ECA. Basically, is it we're jumping over CADR, or is that part of the whole control system as well?
Well, CADR is equivalent clean airflow. It's just the name that AHAM gives to the metric that's produced by their test, but they're really essentially the same thing. The CADR is the ECA for particles.
Yeah, and it's used more for instrumentation, I believe. Is that correct? CADR, you mentioned AHAM.
Well, so it's a portable air cleaner rating standard.
Okay. Yeah, so it's for portable air cleaners, which brings me to the point that I think you had talked about, Bill, and I think maybe Max as well. What's new in this particular standard with regards to air cleaners, as opposed to previous ASHRAE standards?
Well, let me first add that CADR is a concept that was well known before AHAM made a standard out of it. It's simply a way of showing how much for the contaminant of concern, which for them is particles, you get dilution. So it's kind of a filter efficiency times an airflow is what CADR is, and it can be used directly to turn into part of ECA. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, in terms of what more general air cleaners, we have a whole set of standards, of which CADR is one of them. But there are other kinds of air cleaners to use. But one of the key things that we did in 241 is to write a backup standard for ECA. That is, in the appendix of 241, we have a standard that you can follow if there is no other standard for the technology that you want to use. And that's one of the key things that we added.
And what appendix is that? Is that a normative?
Appendix A of 241.
And is that, I believe the terminology is normative?
It's normative because if you need to use it if you want to qualify your technology, and the technology is not otherwise got a standard associated with it.
Understood. Bill, you had a comment to make? Okay, that's fine.
I sure did. I just can't remember what it was now.
That happens.
All right, so let's.
I know what I was going to say. That most
Sure.
of the gaps have to do with air cleaner types that work by putting some kind of agent into the space. So you can think of a number of them to produce reactive species, and also if you do UV in a space, the standards for that were kind of lacking. Some are in development and they just weren't published yet. Unfortunately, you can't reference in one standard another one that hasn't actually been approved for publication. So we were filling a gap until some of these other projects get completed.
Right. Yeah, that's important to keep in mind that many of the standards that are being developed are developing at not warp speed, but basically on normal committee speed, which usually is something of a 2, or in some cases 3-year cycle in terms of these types of standards. So this one is completely different than all of those, that's for sure. So let's talk about another terminology: infection risk management mode, or IRMM. How is it determined that a building should implement IRMM?
Well, it isn't in our standard, and that's a key part of it. IRMM is when you turn on the features of this standard, but we don't say when to do that, because that's going to be perhaps a public health decision. When the public health people say, okay, you need to make your building more resilient, could be an owner decision. This is flu season. I want to make my building a little bit more, but we don't know, we meaning ASHRAE, don't know when the time is right to do this. So we leave it up to the authorities having jurisdiction, which for an epidemic are mostly going to be public health officials, to do that.
And I think there's precedent for that. I mean, if we think back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic, public health authorities told us when we needed to wear masks, so they even closed down businesses. In some cases, they reduced occupancy. So I think that this is really an opportunity for building science and public health to work together. A lot of people have been saying lately that, buildings should be treated as a public health tool. Well, if we're going to do that, then public health needs to get involved. And they're looking at the data. Is a particular type of disease increasing? We now know that they can do wastewater testing that's a leading indicator. So I think there are ways in which the authorities could get involved. But as Max said, could be an owner decision, could be an occupant decision. If I've got an air cleaner in my office and that's how I'm meeting the standard, I can decide to turn it on.
So it could be, in that particular circumstances, it's almost down to an office by office basis, if you look at it that way.
There's a lot of flexibility in the standard. It can be everything from central systems to room by room solutions.
I think public health is a good entity to work with, and there's no doubt about it. They need to make their decisions on terms of this. I'm just not sure they necessarily know what IRMM is at this point, and how would we communicate that to them?
Well, it's a period where risk of airborne disease transmission is sufficiently high that additional protections above normal indoor air quality control should be implemented. That's really what it comes down to. Just like you should wear a mask is an example of the same thing. But people don't want to wear a mask. So what the standard is trying to do is to postpone the time when the authorities say, well, now you have to wear a mask or you can't come into this building at all.
And it's important to add that 241 doesn't address the short-range protection issues that personal protective equipment like a mask does. It's not going to stop somebody from coughing on you and you inhaling it. It's all about what happens in the larger space, in the air that's mixed and distributed from person to person.
Which is not to say that it doesn't have some effect on close range, but we could not take into account things like droplet spray transmission in a 1 meter radius in the calculations that we did.
Well, yeah, there's not going to be many measures that are going to be able to protect you from that other than personal protective equipment when you're at that point.
Right.
Yeah. Now, I could foresee under the circumstances where one building owner decides that they're going to implement IRMM and the building next to it is not, for whatever reason. I guess that becomes a public health issue again, isn't it? Really, they have to communicate successfully to show that there is a need, or in some cases there isn't a need to do the IRMM calculations.
Yeah, it's your choice. And when we saw that during the pandemic, some private school might do something that the public school didn't do, and maybe people don't think of this, but many large corporations have people who are looking at the disease statistics within their companies. If they're worldwide and have lots of locations, there are experts within some of these businesses that would be qualified to make decisions about when they needed to do something to increase the level of protection.
I agree. Unfortunately, sometimes that comes down to the health and safety officer. And I'm not necessarily sure if the health and safety officers in many of these locations and large corporations are necessarily qualified to make a judgment as to whether something should go under IRMM or not. And
that's probably true, but they can probably judge better than we can here sitting today tell them when to do it.
Sure, I agree.
Let me add that I view this standard, even in its current state, as being kind of a provocation and an agent for change. I think that there are a lot of ways in which this standard provokes many thoughts about things we could do differently with our other IAQ standards and in this connection with public health.
Is it fair to assume that that was one of the at least underlying motivations on the speed that you drafted it and just the way that you drafted the document?
Well, we want to take advantage of this moment of opportunity. Whether it was critical to meet the White House's schedule, I think there's still value to getting it out while everyone is thinking about indoor air quality and the consequences of poor indoor air quality, because I think it's the ideas here are getting a broader hearing than they would have if we'd waited 3 years to put something out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can't think of a time in my career where IAQ was more at the forefront of the public's knowledge than because of COVID.
I would agree. And I mean, you get these mass media broadcasts as well. I believe one of our colleagues, Joseph Allen and Lindsay Marr, are going to be we're on, I think, on 60 Minutes this past week. I don't think either one of them would have been called to speak on a forum of that nature unless there was an outcry for better indoor air quality than we have currently, without a doubt.
I mean, it's definitely a unique opportunity we're in right now, but it's also, we have to seize the moment as an industry, right? Because we will not have this critical point in time again where there is a public awareness, I think, globally about indoor environmental issues. It's certainly not to this extent. And, I think it behooves us all in the industry to drive this as hard as we can at this point.
And these standards for air cleaners, I think, again, that's something that, maybe is painful to try to comply with them and to get standards written that are going to be effective, but really those kinds of code enforceable standards that can give you confidence in what a technology is doing, I think are really critical to the long-term success of this approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I think 241 has the benefit of sort of the contrapositive of what we just talked about, and that is it allows one to define what's a safe and effective mechanism, which helps exclude those which are not, because we all know during a crisis there are people who try to jump in, well-meaning or otherwise, to fill the gap, and they're not always doing it correctly.
Correct. Yeah. Max, a follow-up to the IRMM, I'm wondering, do you anticipate that this will be something that will be implemented in residential buildings as well?
I don't know that it would become a code in residential buildings, but I could see that builders and developers might wish to take credit for it and saying it's 241 compliant. It may not be that expensive to do in new construction. I can also see it being useful in multifamily. If you're talking about a high-rise multifamily building, people might be willing to pay more rent to be in one that has protections against future epidemics rather than being exposed to their neighbors. So I see those levels of it being used in residential. I can see individual homeowners wanting to upgrade their home to be that, but I don't see it as regulation.
Okay, that's fair. Bill, can you kind of give us some idea what the building readiness plans? It seems like that's a new requirement for many building operators. I may be wrong, but what do you expect to be included in a business readiness plan?
A building readiness plan is actually a term that was coined by the Epidemic Task Force, and this was the work product of our commissioning and testing and balancing experts on the committee, and essentially it starts, if you have an existing building, with a thorough assessment of all of the systems that may have an impact on IAQ. So you go through the whole mechanical system, components, control sequences, are things adjusted correctly, and determine what the maintenance items are, and you assess what is the equivalent clean air delivery that the systems are providing as they are, and then you calculate the target you're supposed to meet according to Section 5 based on the requirements. And if there's a difference there, if there's a deficit, then you go through the exercise of doing an engineering study essentially to determine what the best option is. And at the end of all of that, you document everything in this building readiness plan. So it tells you that clearly what you have and what needs to be fixed and what you're going to do to implement infection risk management mode. So it becomes the basic documentation of airborne infection control systems for the building, and it should reside there in the building in current form for use by the facility staff ever after. So that's really all it is the documentation of the assessment and planning for a particular building. And if you go down the line to say single family residences, obviously you don't need to produce a building readiness plan for your single family home, but the concepts are there of thinking through that process and deciding what to do so that it's done in advance. I think this is one of the important things. We're now more than 3 years into the pandemic, and a lot of facilities are still trying to figure out what to do. If they had all had plans in place, all they would have done was implement them by changing control modes.
Right. Sometimes all you need to do is the plan. That is, you may have all the capacity in a given building to meet the requirements, and all you have to do is go through the planning and write it down to say that when IRMM is triggered, go out and do these things. So there can be almost zero cost to implementing 241, depending on the building.
Right. Now, this building readiness plans, I agree that an assessment of the building needs to be done. Who, Bill or Max, who do you expect will be doing those type of assessments? What professional credentials might they need or want to have somebody do an assessment of that nature?
Well, I would say it might be interesting to go back and look at what's in the building readiness section of the Epidemic Task Force documentation, because they talk there about what a team should be to do a building readiness plan. So it's really kind of multidisciplinary, but I think commissioning specialists, technicians, or engineers, and test and balance contractors are part of it. Facilities staff, owners should be involved, and perhaps just the professionals that generally deal with the HVAC for a building. So it's kind of a broad team, so you get all of the necessary angles on what needs to go into this planning process.
ASHRAE standards don't in general tell you who has to do something, only what has to be done. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've done here. But we have always envisioned that there could be guidance documents that help suggest ways in which things could be done for the future. And that's kind of one of the many activities on our eventual to-do list.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's important to have that, really, because I think there's going to be a lot of people, some well-meaning, some just out to make a buck, who are going to claim that they know how to do building readiness plans better than anybody else for a cheaper price. And I think having a guide will probably be very helpful for people who want to pick out somebody to do this type of work. So I'm all for it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You really do need to, there needs to be some guidance as to what the requisite qualifications of the team should be. That's pretty important.
Well, there are a lot of state laws that are under consideration, model air quality laws. Johns Hopkins published a model air quality law, but there are actually maybe almost 10 states now that are considering some kinds of bills, and those generally do address qualifications of people who will do this assessment and planning work.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that model plan. It was discussed this week at the AIHA's IQ committee, so it's beginning some resonance at this point. People are really interested in figuring out who's going to do these types of assessments, because there are obviously thousands, if not millions, of buildings that could potentially want to have a building readiness plan as part of their operation maintenance program. So it'd be interesting to see how that develops. I was wondering, we've pretty much already touched on this, but I want to give Max another chance to kind of explain what is the process for continuing maintenance, particularly for this particular committee. I understand from Bill that we already have a standard. We have about 12 new questions or comments coming in. How does the committee intend to interact with the people making these comments and questions? What is the process? How does somebody get involved in that?
Okay, so this standard is under continuous maintenance in the regular way ASHRAE does things. That means that anybody can submit a continuous maintenance proposal, and the committee has to review it in a relatively timely manner and decide whether they want to put it out as an actual proposed change, whether they don't like it at all and want to throw it out, or whether they want to consider something like it down the road. So anybody who sees an error or what something could be improved can write a specific change. And a specific change means not just I think you should write more on XYZ. It kind of means add this text or change this text or delete this, or something specific that the committee can actually vote on. Now, that's the normal process. That's what we'll be doing. But as I said before, we also have to reopen the whole standard eventually as an ANSI standard. And that means that there will be a full public review of the entire standard at some time in the future. And people can respond to that when it happens by writing comments on any particular piece that they like.
Yeah, I think that the key in that is that it has to be specific in terms of language. I think a lot of people think that if, well, you didn't cover this particular topic, will get you to respond in some way. Actual fact, it has to be very specific as to what the change is in language, or the calculation is not exactly right. If you don't give something specific, I know in most cases, having served on 62.1, you pretty much get rejected or turned back unless you have something very specific in terms of changes.
Yeah, that's right. If you say something very general, the committee only has to respond very general, like, no, thank you, we don't think so. Or, yeah, we're considering that, but we're not doing anything about it right now.
You need, be specific and have a persuasive argument, both.
Right. It has to have not only the statement as to what the change may be, but it has to have, as you say, a persuasive argument as to why that change is really critical to be made in that regard. So that's important to keep in mind, because I think a lot of people are going to be, particularly when you get to the ANSI process, you're going to have a lot of comments. And I know Max and Bill, shall we say you both have a slightly different viewpoint on whether or not to go forward with ANSI, or whether you think it's something we should be doing at this point. So Bill, why don't you?
Max is antsier about going forward than I am. I think
well said.
ANSI, that was actually a Claire Ramspeck joke for those who remember her. But I think we need to get there. I think we just discuss, is this something we should start today or 6 months from now? Or but I agree that ultimately the standard needs to be ANSI before credible.
We had hoped that it wouldn't be necessary, that 62.1, 62.2, 170 would basically adopt their own versions of it, and we wouldn't need a 241. That seems, from a practical standpoint, that is simply not going to happen that way for all sorts of reasons. So we're going to have to go forward with doing that. And the question is about the timing. And we have to, whatever we can make changes right now to the ASHRAE standard 241 if we wish to, but no matter what we do or don't do, we have to put out the whole thing all over again when we do the ANSI review. So the most effective time to do that is not exactly clear. That's something that the committee is going to discuss amongst itself.
Yeah,
Okay.
Max is more pessimistic than I am about eventually changing 62.1 and 62.2, but I'm not optimistic that will happen anytime soon.
Right. Having served on 62.1, I know Max served on 62.2. I don't, Bill, you may have served on one of these standard setting groups other than 241 as well. The process, it is continuous maintenance, and it is brought up on a regular basis, but it can take time. It's not going to happen next week.
Also, it's important to point out that 241 includes both new and existing buildings. 62.1 doesn't include existing buildings.
Right.
So there's a bit of an overlap in scope. So what standard would do existing commercial buildings? And it's not clear that there's one to use at the moment. So it's those kind of problems that have to be worked through.
Well, I mean, as a design standard, yes, but interestingly, there's a quite well-developed maintenance requirement in 62.1. The problem is that nobody adopts that to enforce it. What comes out of 62.1 and goes into the code are design requirements, not operating requirements, and that's another big issue that I think we need to support. Better air quality is some reasonable level of regulation of buildings in operation, which has been coming along for some time for energy.
Yeah, that is I mean, one of the things that is going on in parallel with this is the whole decarbonization of buildings. And how do you see the interaction of that particular exercise that's going on right now in many buildings, and perhaps putting together something for 241? Do you see some kind of parallels between the two?
I would say not too many, because we don't intend to be operating IRMM very often. So the energy impacts are generally pretty small. If for some reason you wanted a building to operate in that mode all the time, then you might seriously consider the most energy efficient ways to do that. But this is an indoor air quality type standard. That is, it's a health and safety standard, and it doesn't directly have a lot of energy impact. So I don't see a huge overlap.
Okay.
But I would say that there's an indirect influence on 241 is that if we weren't concerned about how much energy was involved in these higher levels of airborne infection risk reduction, then maybe you could operate that way all the time. But one of the things that we've been dealing with continuously since COVID started was concern about increased energy use and increased carbon emissions. So it is reacting to that to some extent. There are other reasons to only invoke what's in 241 when it's really needed.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I noted that is in this is new standard is the equivalent outdoor air calculator. And I believe this is an updated one from the one that was provided by the ASHRAE ETF. Is there differences between the ETF version and the one in standard 241?
Well, yes, we call it the equivalent clean air calculator in 241, and it was the equivalent outdoor air calculator in the ETF. So that's one change, but it mainly just updated. The same
updated
thing. Spreadsheet helper that will get you to what does this combination of controls get me for ECAI. That wasn't a term that existed prior to 241. So those are the kinds of changes we've seen so far.
So this calculator is a like an Excel sheet calculator type of thing, and it allows you to take what you have in terms of measurements and convert it into ECA. I mean.
Yeah, measurements, or even just you can choose a different filter for a system. It could be used to look at a system that in a building that hasn't been constructed yet.
Well, that would be helpful, wouldn't it? In some ways, you have it as even before the building is up and running. You can calculate this and figure out exactly what you need in way of ventilation and filters and things like that.
You enter all the basic relevant data: the population, the volume of the space, how much outdoor air do you have, what is the efficiency of the filter, how much recirculated air, all of those sorts of things. So you can generate an ECAI for the existing building, and then if that's short of what you need for the system that you're looking at, or the space you're looking at, then you can start changing things as you develop some options to see what it takes to get there. And then you can compare them really outside the spreadsheet on the basis of how much is that going to cost, how much is going to cost to operate, how much energy use does it, how much does it change the energy use.
So that's where you may have the interaction, I guess, between 241 and energy use, I guess, in that regard. Although, as Max has mentioned, it's probably not substantial. It's pretty negligible in terms of if you go into that IRMM mode, it's probably not a substantial energy upgrade. So, Max, you had something to say on this?
Not on the calculator itself, but
okay.
I think it's important to keep in mind that for different kinds of buildings, the way you may want to comply is very different. For example, if you have an office building and you can only increase the amount of ECA cheaply so much, you may decide that it makes sense to reduce the occupancy because you're going to send some fraction of the people home. Whereas you can't do that in a residential section because that's where people are going to go when they get sent home. They're going to go home. And so you can't really reduce occupancy there, which is why you have to have other means of improving the situation in a residential environment. So there's some differences depending on the occupancy category.
And a lot of differences based on the kind of HVAC you have. If you have a dedicated outdoor air system with radiant panels, then the only airflow you've got is 100% outside air. And you can't put a filter in that system to remove anything that's generated in the space. So then you have to look at in the space solutions. If you have a variable air volume system, you may have 6 or 7 times the airflow and most of it's recirculated. So they're putting some kind of control into the central system may be effective. So that's why you can't really prescriptively specify the right solutions. You have to simply create requirements that can be adapted to whatever the conditions are in a given building.
And one of the approaches that's really difficult at the moment and needs improvement is the natural ventilation one. We allow for it, but we don't really describe very well how to do it because we couldn't figure that out. And a lot of buildings throughout the world are naturally ventilated, and so how you figure that out is something that needs more work in the standard.
So basically, that brings up an interesting point. This particular standard obviously is written in general, for what I would consider to be the developed countries, as opposed to the developing countries. Do you see this as having a major impact in places where you have natural ventilation and now want to convert over to mechanical, which seems to be happening in many parts of the world at the moment?
Well, I don't think it's just a developing country sort of point of view. If you look at Europe, for example, they use a lot of natural ventilation already, and I guess we'll count Europe as a developed part of the world.
Yes,
so so they use a lot of natural ventilation, and so they're going to have trouble figuring out exactly how to implement it. They may have trouble in natural ventilation for other reasons too, as climate change makes the demand for cooling larger and larger. The European countries have to account for that, which many of them don't at the moment. As cities, if the air quality in cities continues to be bad, natural ventilation in cities is hard to deal with. So there are lots of issues involving natural ventilation, and they're not just in developing countries.
The cost of compliance would be a factor in some regions that were economically developing.
Yeah, I would think so. But that right now, that's, shall we say, is not totally taken into account with regards to the 241, and certainly that'll be something in the future to take a look at in terms of
cost effectiveness assessments and energy use assessments are really outside of what the standard covers now. We certainly expect those to be considerations that a user would apply, but we don't say anything about how to do that in the standard.
But we do try to enable as many different modes of compliance and many ways to get there as possible so that you can apply the ones that make the most sense in your situation. And
Yeah,
so we don't want to exclude natural ventilation as an option, but we don't know how to do it quite right yet.
There was an article, and I guess it was the September ASHRAE journal by Marwa Zatari and some colleagues, and it's very interesting because they looked at it, and it was 6 or so different ways of complying with 241 for a school, and then they were specifically looking at the difference between increasing outdoor air or applying better filters, MERV 7 to MERV 13, and also what happens if you use energy recovery and apply the indoor air quality procedure instead of the ventilation rate procedure to get the outdoor air requirement. That's something we should probably also mention, that we don't restrict the application of standard 62.1 to the prescriptive ventilation rate procedure. You can use the indoor air quality procedure, which was recently substantially updated, and that has the potential to allow you to reduce energy use quite a bit and still comply.
Yeah, I saw that article. That was an excellent article, and it does really address a lot of those interests that people have in this area, how it's going to affect natural ventilation and in other aspects of it. There was one, I think, in the October edition of the ASHRAE Journal by Richard Burns, who's an economist with, I think, Johns Hopkins. And he talked about the various ways you can comply with it and what will be the cost of complying with that. And also that should be noted as an excellent article that can talk about that particular aspect of this issue.
Yeah, he was looking at, I think, the overall cost effectiveness of applying the standard, and certainly that's there. We should mention that we're trying to keep a kind of a regular feature going with short columns in the ASHRAE Journal that deal with different dimensions of the standard, as well as encouraging some longer articles to be written. So that's one way that we're trying to educate interested people about the standard and to get useful, practical information out about it.
So I'm running down to the last couple of questions here, Bill. I'll have you answer this one. Max, you can jump in at any time. Is the only way for the new standard to have impact as you want it to is by adoption by authorities, or is there other value to the standard?
Well, I hope it's not the only way for it to have value. I think the fact that everyone's talking about it, it's being discussed so much, shows that it does have value even outside of being adopted by code authorities. I think if we could get some big landlords to use it, for example, the GSA in the US would be an example, I think it would have a lot of impact. So I don't think that's necessary, although that's certainly something that we'd like to pursue.
And code, go ahead, Max.
I would just augment that by saying code is one way to do it, but I don't actually see it as the most significant way, because I think people want to do something. They want to have solutions to this problem, and they will turn to this standard as a solution for what I want. So I'm imagining that it will be done far more in a voluntary case than it will be in a regulatory case. I
see. One last question, and this is really just a futuristic type question. What changes in Standard 241 do you anticipate will be considered by the committee in the next couple of years?
Well, certainly air distribution.
Distribution. Tell us a little bit more about that. You mentioned that previously, but I wasn't sure we got everything we needed to do out of that section. Tell us more about that.
Well, we've had lots of discussions about how we know that airflow patterns in a space influence how effectively contaminants are removed. If you look at standard 62.1, we have breathing zone outdoor airflow rates in table 6.1 that assume perfect mixing, which doesn't even actually happen. But then you go from there to correcting those based on what kind of air distribution you actually have. Is it underfloor air distribution? Is it displacement? Is it overhead with effective mixing, or maybe ineffective mixing? So you apply a credit there. So we need that kind of information. And I think there's also a desire to put in more requirements that relate to how you would use in-room air cleaners. There was a lot of concern about an in-room air cleaner that has a fan disrupting stratified ventilation that was put there to improve the air quality in other ways. So I think those are some of the main things that we need to work on there.
And Max, you have the final word on this?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we need to do more work on the natural ventilation side,
Right.
And the mixed mode, which means combining natural and mechanical. Also, we need probably to improve Appendix A a bit. It's a major step forward, but for example, the safety part of Appendix A is limited only to a few things. And the things that we knew were the most important, but there are lots of active technologies potentially out there, and we haven't looked at them all in enough depth. What we'd actually like to happen is that standards writers do this, that they write test methods for particular technologies that include the safety, so we can just reference them. But Appendix A is a fallback for all those things where there aren't standards, and I think perhaps it needs to be upgraded a little bit over time.
Could you just one last question I said, but I wanted to hit on that safety aspect. What is specifically, Max, are you talking safety of the equipment, safety of the personnel? Who is it?
No, none of those things. No,
Okay.
The fact that an active technology can produce products or byproducts which themselves may be problematic. So, for example, UV light on certain surfaces may change chemicals and induce a formation of things which are hazardous. Have we dealt with that enough? Technology can produce ozone. We have dealt with that by requiring UL 2998, which is an ozone requirement. Active technologies could convert one VOC to another. So we have a test method that charges it with limonene, a common cleaning compound, and looks for formaldehyde, the poster child of most VOC problems inside homes. So we do have some of that. I'm thinking we probably don't have enough yet, but that's an area that could use some development.
Great, thank you. All right, so Bob, you have anything further that you want to discuss?
Well, this went too fast, I think, is what I would like to mention. And I think there's so much more to discuss here. So I would say that we do need to bring these guests back and continue this conversation, because this is super important, and it's definitely going to be evolving. So.
And it's very pertinent to the people I know who are in the industrial hygiene and health and safety area. There's a lot of discussion, but not a lot of yet questions, shall we say, but they are being developed, and I can tell you you're going to be getting quite a few of them at that level, and as to how the people in the health and safety side of it are looking at this particular standard. So,
well, then let me give a little bit of a plug that at the meeting in ASHRAE this winter in Chicago, we're going to have a panel discussion with a few of the greats from 241 sitting up front and fielding all the questions that the audience wants to ask. So anybody who's attending that, I encourage them to come and listen and or ask the question that concerns them.
And for those who like deep dives, there are going to be 2 3-hour short courses on Tuesday of the conference. One in the morning is going to be Marwa Zatari and myself, basically covering the requirements parts of it. In the afternoon, we'll have Wade Conlon and Megan McNulty doing implementation. So they're going to focus on how do you develop a building readiness plan. So there will be a lot of educational material there for those who are eager to use the standard.
Yeah, that's great.
That's fabulous. So I would say, Bill and Max, both kudos to you both and the rest of your 241 committee, just for being able to get this really revolutionary document out, and it's out in the world, which is fabulous in such a short order.
Well, it was very satisfying. It was a lot of hard work, but we got it done, and we're eager to keep developing it and make it really the practically useful standard that we've envisioned it to be.
Excellent.
So Max, you gave us a kind of a preview of this panel, but you didn't mention any names. Anybody we would be interested in knowing?
Well, I'm going to chair it, and
Okay.
Bill is one of the panel members, but
Okay.
we have the leads from several of the working groups that are going to be there to talk about air cleaning and implementation. And pretty much we have every topic covered by the panel. So
sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. Sounds real good. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Bob, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, like I always do. So anyway, thank you so very much for watching this episode of the Indoor Environment Show. Again, the show is a product of the IAQ-GA, Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance, and in collaboration with Healthy Indoors Media. So we'll see you again next month. I'm not going to say same bat time, same bat channel, but sometime around this. Actually, this worked out that we came on simultaneously with IAQ Radio, which we never do. This is the first time we've ever done this. And it was just a scheduling issue, but we'll be back probably on our normal time and day, I'm assuming.
Yes, we probably will.
I'm assuming. I don't know. At this point, I can't tell you.
Definitely not on Thanksgiving, but
definitely not. No.
The gentleman could stay after he closes. We'd appreciate it. So just stay for a second. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. Well, we'll catch you next time and for the next episode of Indoor Environments. Take care.